The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade by Britain in 1807 and the subsequent emancipation of enslaved people in the British Empire in 1833 have long been presented in broad terms as a pivotal shift away from a system of coerced labor. Closer examination reveals that these measures emerged from a complex interplay of economic pressures, strategic calculations, and internal power realignments rather than isolated ethical imperatives. The West Indian sugar plantations central to the British slave economy experienced diminishing returns due to soil exhaustion from intensive monoculture and overproduction that saturated markets and depressed prices. This decline coincided with the rise of industrial capitalism, which favored flexible wage labor in factories over the rigid, high-mortality structure of plantation slavery. As a result, the old mercantilist framework protecting colonial monopolies became a fiscal burden, prompting a pivot toward free trade and new commercial opportunities in regions such as Asia and Africa. Geopolitical considerations further shaped the timing and execution of these policies. The 1807 ban occurred amid the Napoleonic Wars, enabling Britain to disrupt the supply lines of French, Spanish, and other rival powers reliant on slave labor in their colonies. Naval enforcement through squadrons patrolling the African coast served dual purposes, projecting imperial influence while facilitating access to alternative resources like palm oil under the banner of legitimate commerce. Slave revolts across the Caribbean, including major uprisings in Jamaica, heightened the costs of maintaining the system through property destruction and increased security demands. These events rendered the status quo unsustainable, leading plantation owners and parliamentary interests to view compensated abolition as a pragmatic mechanism to mitigate risks and stabilize transitions. The process also involved substantial financial restructuring that benefited established elites. The 1833 Act allocated significant compensation to slave owners, financed through government borrowing that recycled capital into emerging industrial and banking sectors. This framework underscores how abolition aligned with broader shifts in domestic political influence, as the reform of parliamentary representation diminished the sway of traditional planter lobbies. Far from a singular moral triumph, the measures reflected calculated responses to profitability thresholds, wartime advantages, and internal factional dynamics. Such realities highlight the multifaceted nature of the institution's decline and invite scrutiny of oversimplified accounts that overlook these interconnected drivers, economic and geopolitical imperatives in the British abolition. British involvement in the transatlantic slave trade waned as the economic viability of its core colonial enterprises eroded under specific pressures. Overproduction of sugar in the West Indies led to market gluts that reduced re-export profits and strained the protected monopoly system. Soil depletion from continuous cultivation further diminished yields, while competition from fresher lands in Cuba, Brazil, and French holdings intensified the squeeze on British planters. These conditions transformed the colonies from assets into liabilities, aligning abolition with a transition to industrial free trade that prioritized manufacturing efficiency and open markets over outdated mercantilist arrangements. Strategic wartime considerations amplified the decision to end the trade. During the Napoleonic conflicts, prohibiting British participation allowed naval forces to interdict enemy shipping, economically weakening rival colonial operations without additional direct engagements. This approach extended imperial reach by establishing new spheres of influence in Africa through commerce in non-slave goods. The policy thus served as an instrument of asymmetric advantage, converting a declining sector into a tool for geopolitical leverage while minimizing fiscal exposure. Domestic political maneuvers complemented these external factors. The weakening of planter influence through parliamentary reforms enabled industrial and reformist factions to advance changes that redirected resources toward manufacturing centers. Slave resistance, manifesting in large-scale revolts, escalated operational costs and threatened stability, prompting owners to accept compensated measures as a means to exit the system without catastrophic losses. Collectively, these elements demonstrate that abolition responded to converging economic, strategic, and political thresholds rather than abstract benevolence. Financial mechanisms and compensation in the abolition process. The compensation scheme embedded in the 1833 abolition legislation represented a deliberate transfer of wealth that facilitated the orderly wind-down of the plantation system. Parliament authorized a substantial payment to owners equivalent to a large portion of annual government revenue, structured as a loan underwritten by a syndicate of bankers. This arrangement provided immediate liquidity to former slaveholders, many of whom maintained absentee investments in Britain and channeled the funds into urban finance and industrial ventures. The mechanism ensured continuity of elite capital without disrupting broader economic momentum. Theories of involvement by specific banking interests highlight the role of the compensation loan in reshaping financial power. Nathan Mayer Rothschild and associated figures participated in underwriting the debt, which generated long-term interest streams serviced by taxpayers. Proponents of these perspectives argue that the financing enabled a shift from plantation-based wealth to modern banking dominance, with the loan creating enduring government obligations. Such accounts also note earlier minor ties to slave-related collateral, framing the process as a coordinated extraction of value from the system's regulated conclusion. These financial dynamics extended to political leverage, as access to elite circles through wartime lending positioned bankers to influence legislative outcomes. The compensation not only secured planter acquiescence, but also aligned abolition with emerging free trade ideologies that favored cosmopolitan capital over colonial agriculture. In this light, the measures advanced structural transformations that consolidated influence in new economic spheres, while managing the transition from one form of asset control to another. Strategies of demographic disruption and internal destabilization through slavery. Importing enslaved labor from distant regions served as a deliberate tactic to fragment local power structures and prevent unified opposition. Rulers selected dislocated groups lacking kinship ties to native populations, ensuring loyalty to central authority. In the Ottoman context, systems of enslavement and training produced elite forces that bypassed traditional aristocracies and enforced imperial control. Similar patterns appeared in colonial settings where foreign captives policed agricultural workers, forging distinct enforcer classes that layered divisions within labor hierarchies. British strategists during the American Revolution and the War of 1812 mobilized enslaved populations as internal assets against colonial opponents. Proclamations offering freedom to those joining royal forces created literal enemy units within territories, disrupting plantations and diverting resources from the patriot effort. These actions exploited existing fears of slave resistance to fracture unity and impose additional military burdens. Parallel uses in Caribbean conflicts armed select groups to weaken rivals, turning potential threats into instruments of chaos. Selective manumission further engineered power shifts when controlling factions weakened. In revolutionary France's colonies, arming and freeing portions of the enslaved escalated into full-scale upheaval that dismantled plantation economies and altered regional dominance. Post-emancipation arrangements in various contexts, including apprenticeship periods and subsequent labor imports, maintained coercion under new guises, while demographic changes amplified cultural tensions. These precedents illustrate how slave-master relations and population movements functioned as levers for long-term destabilization, enabling elites to play groups against one another for sustained advantage. The universal practice of slavery across history and cultures. Slavery operated as a foundational institution across all recorded civilizations, with every major society engaging in both enslavement and subjugation at various stages. Ancient Mesopotamia regulated slave ownership through legal codes that addressed war captives, debtors, and hereditary status. Egypt, Greece, and Rome scaled the practice to massive levels, incorporating conquered peoples into labor, military, and domestic roles. These systems treated slavery as an ordinary extension of conquest and economic organization rather than an aberration. African kingdoms maintained internal networks of enslavement that supplied captives to Arab and later European traders, demonstrating continuity predating transoceanic routes. The Arab trade spanned centuries and vast geographies, moving millions through trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean corridors for military, domestic, and agricultural purposes. Asian empires, pre-Columbian American societies, and European groups, including Vikings and Barbary operators, likewise employed slavery in forms adapted to local power structures. No single ethnicity originated or monopolized the practice. It reflected recurring patterns of dominance and resource extraction. The transatlantic variant industrialized and racialized an existing framework, transporting millions while building upon prior African and Arab infrastructures. Yet its scale and mechanics fit within the broader continuum of human coercion. All groups experienced both sides of the dynamic, underscoring slavery's universality as a tool of statecraft and economy rather than a phenomenon confined to one era or people. The evolution and contemporary forms of slavery. The legal termination of chattel plantation slavery did not eradicate coercion, but allowed it to adapt to industrial and global economic conditions. Indentured labor schemes and sharecropping replaced direct ownership, while modern supply chains integrated forced work into agriculture, construction, manufacturing, and mining. Debt mechanisms trapped individuals and families in perpetual repayment through labor, with manipulated terms preventing exit. These transformations preserved the extraction of value without formal title to persons. Contemporary estimates indicate approximately 50 million people subject to modern slavery at any time, encompassing forced labor, human trafficking, and related practices. Forced commercial sexual exploitation and state-imposed labor add further dimensions, generating substantial illegal profits annually. Forced marriage imposes lifelong control absent consent, while child exploitation and domestic servitude exploit vulnerabilities in migration and poverty. These forms thrive across regions, driven by private economies and weak enforcement structures. The focus on historical episodes while contemporary coercion persists reveals a selective lens that overlooks ongoing realities. Slavery to economic necessity, debt, or institutional manipulation mirrors earlier dynamics in updated contexts. Recognition of these continuities challenges narratives that treat abolition as a conclusive moral endpoint, emphasizing instead the institution's capacity to evolve while serving persistent imperatives of power and profit. Conclusion: the hidden truth behind British slave trade abolition. The abolition of the transatlantic slave trade and associated emancipation measures responded to intersecting economic declines, geopolitical opportunities, and internal instabilities that rendered the plantation system untenable for British interests. Compensation arrangements, strategic naval actions, and responses to revolts facilitated a controlled transition that preserved elite capital and redirected resources toward industrial priorities. These processes operated alongside theories of financial orchestration that positioned banking syndicates to benefit from debt structures and broader economic shifts. Throughout history, slavery manifested as a universal mechanism of labor control and demographic management, employed by diverse civilizations to centralize authority and disrupt cohesion. Tactics of importation, mobilization as internal forces, and selective freeing generated lasting fractures that advanced ruling objectives. The institution's persistence in contemporary forms demonstrates its adaptability to new economic and social conditions, encompassing debt, bondage, trafficking, and forced exploitation on a global scale. Platitudes that attribute abolition to collective moral awakening obscure the calculated realities of power and profit that drove policy. Selective outrage over past variants, while modern slavery affects millions, reflects a detachment from the full continuum of coercion. True engagement with the subject requires acknowledging slavery's enduring presence across time and cultures, free from oversimplifications that serve rhetorical convenience rather than historical precision. This reassessment underscores the need to confront the institution in all its manifestations, past and present, as an integral element of human organizational strategies.